Every emotion you have ever felt, the rage, the shame, the longing, the fear, what if none of it actually started inside you? The ancient Gnostic texts discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, describe invisible forces that do not attack the body but feed directly on human emotional states. And they have been doing it since before recorded history began. There is a moment most people have experienced at least once in their lives. You are sitting quietly. Nothing is wrong. Nothing has happened. And then without any warning, a wave of anxiety moves through your chest. Or rage surfaces with no clear cause. Or a deep, hollow sadness settles over you like a fog that arrived from somewhere outside the edges of your own mind. You try to trace it back. You search your thoughts for the source. But the origin was not there. It felt like something that had passed through you rather than something that had grown inside you. Most people dismiss those moments. They blame tiredness, stress, a chemical imbalance, the weather. They reach for the most convenient explanation and they move on. But the ancient Gnostic teachers who lived and wrote in the centuries surrounding the early Common Era did not dismiss those moments. They studied them. They mapped them. And what they described was so threatening to the structures of power surrounding them that their writings were condemned, their communities were scattered, and their texts were buried in sealed clay jars beneath the desert sands of Egypt, where they remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years. What those teachers described was not a metaphor. It was not poetry. It was a precise and detailed account of non-physical intelligences that they called the Archons, forces that did not interact with the human body directly, but operated instead through something far more intimate and far more difficult to defend against. They operated through emotion itself, through the inner weather of the human soul, through the invisible tides of feeling that every human being assumes are entirely their own. To understand why this idea is so significant, you have to first understand what the Gnostic tradition believed about the nature of reality and about the nature of the human being living inside it. The Gnostics did not see the material world as the creation of a perfect and loving divine source. They saw it as something constructed by a lesser intelligence, a being they called the demiurge, a craftsman of limitation who shaped the physical universe not out of wisdom, but out of blindness. This being, they taught, was not evil in the way that word is commonly understood. It was simply cut off from the true source of all existence, a boundless and indivisible presence they called the monad or the one. Because the demiurge could not perceive that higher source, it built a world in its own image, a world of separation, of time, of decay, of hierarchy, and of forgetting. And to maintain that world, to keep it functioning as a system of containment, the demiurge surrounded itself with subordinate forces. These were the Archons. In the original Greek language, the word archon simply means ruler. But in the Gnostic understanding, these were not rulers in any political sense. They were currents of influence, patterns of perception, forces that worked not through armies or laws, but through something far more effective and far more invisible. They worked through the architecture of inner experience, through the way a human being feels, reacts, craves, fears, and suffers. The Nag Hammadi texts, which were discovered in 1945 by a farmer digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt, contain multiple detailed descriptions of the Archons and their methods. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete and significant of these texts, describes the Archons as having been assigned to specific layers of the cosmos, each one governing a particular frequency of human experience. One governs ignorance. One governs desire. One governs grief. One governs fear. One governs enslavement. These were not random assignments. They were a system, a carefully constructed mechanism designed to keep human consciousness cycling through predictable emotional states, never resting long enough in stillness to remember what it truly was beneath all that motion. This is the part that requires a slow and honest reading. The Gnostic teachers were not saying that human beings do not have genuine emotions. They were not dismissing the reality of feeling. What they were pointing toward was something more precise and more unsettling. They were saying that certain emotional patterns, specifically those rooted in fear, shame, guilt, rage, despair, and obsessive craving, are not native to the deepest nature of the human soul. They are, in the language of these ancient teachers, transmissions, signals from an external system passing through the nervous system of a human being who has forgotten how to tell the difference between what is genuinely their own and what has been inserted from outside. Think about what that means in practical terms. Think about the last time you felt a sudden surge of jealousy. Not a slow building recognition that something was wrong in a relationship, but a hot, immediate, almost electrical spike of jealousy that arrived before a single thought had formed. Where did that come from? Think about the last time shame moved through you, not because you had reflected on something and recognized a genuine failure, but because a single glance from another person or a single word in a message triggered something that felt ancient and total and crushing. Think about how quickly rage can appear when you're driving or waiting in a line or reading something on a screen. That speed, that immediacy, that feeling of being overtaken rather than choosing. The Gnostics would have recognized it immediately. They would have named it. They would have said, "That is not yours." That is the language of the Archons moving through an unguarded gate. But how exactly does this transmission work? How does a non-physical force communicate through the interior life of a human being? The Gnostic texts describe the mechanism in symbolic language, but the structure is surprisingly precise when you read it carefully. The Archons do not create emotions from nothing. They cannot. They are imitators, not creators. The Apocryphon of John is very clear about this limitation. The Archons can only work with what already exists. What they do is amplify, distort, and redirect. They take a genuine feeling, a real and legitimate human response, and they expand it beyond its natural proportion. They extend it past the moment that called it forth. They twist it inward so that it begins feeding on itself rather than resolving. A natural grief becomes a permanent identity of loss. A reasonable caution becomes a paralytic fear that reaches into every corner of a person's life. A moment of legitimate anger becomes a story of victimhood that the person carries for decades. This is the hidden language. It speaks in your own voice. It uses your own memories. It uses the particular textures of your individual history to construct emotional states that feel completely personal, completely authentic, completely yours, and are therefore almost impossible to question. When an external authority tells you what to think, you can resist. When the bars of a cage are visible, you can push against them. But when the cage is built from your own feelings, your own fears, your own sense of who you are and what you deserve and what is possible for you, when the walls of your confinement are made from the most intimate materials of your inner life, resistance becomes nearly impossible, because resistance would require you to question your own experience. And that is the most difficult thing a human being can do. The Gnostic teachers knew this, and they spent considerable energy in their texts and in their communities teaching their students how to begin doing exactly that, not through suppression of emotion. The Gnostic path was never about becoming cold or detached, but through a practice of discernment that they considered to be one of the primary skills of an awakening soul. The ability to sit with an emotional state and ask a specific and disciplined question. Is this mine, or is this moving through me? That question sounds simple. In practice, it is one of the most demanding things a human being can attempt, because the moment you ask it, the emotional state intensifies. The Gnostic texts describe this pattern with remarkable consistency. When a student began developing the capacity for inner observation, the pressure increased. Emotions became louder. Old wounds surfaced with new force. Confusion multiplied. The teachers did not frame this as a sign that something had gone wrong. They framed it as confirmation that something had gone right. Because the system that depended on unconsciousness responds to awareness the same way that a parasite responds to the withdrawal of its food source. It pulls harder before it releases. This is why the Gnostics place such emphasis on the concept of gnosis itself, direct knowing, immediate recognition that bypasses the ordinary mechanisms of thought and belief. Gnosis in this context was not an intellectual achievement. It was not the accumulation of correct information about cosmology or theology. It was a specific and undeniable inner experience, the moment when a human being, even briefly, recognizes the difference between the observer and what is being observed. The moment when you notice that there is something in you that is watching the fear, and that this watching presence is not itself afraid. The moment when the wave of shame passes through and something remains behind it that is not ashamed. That residue, that silent and unshakable witness, the Gnostics called it the divine spark. The fragment of the monad that had become entangled in the demiurge's world, but had never actually become part of it. The Archons, in a Gnostic understanding, cannot touch that spark. This is described explicitly in the Apocryphon of John and echoed in the Hypostasis of the Archons, another of the Nag Hammadi texts. The spark is beyond their reach. What they work with is everything that has been layered on top of it. The accumulated identities, the inherited fears, the emotional programs that were installed long before a person was old enough to evaluate them. The work of awakening in the Gnostic tradition was not the construction of something new. It was the careful and patient removal of everything that did not belong. Layer by layer, transmission by transmission, pattern by pattern, until what remained was something that could not be manipulated, could not be amplified, could not be redirected, because it had no edge for those forces to grip. Now bring this forward into the world you actually inhabit. The Archons in the Gnostic cosmology were described as rulers of specific cosmic layers, positioned between the human soul and the true divine source. But the function they serve does not require a literal cosmic architecture to remain relevant. Look at the world as it is constructed today and ask yourself, what does it optimize for? What does it reward? What does it cultivate in the people who live inside it? The answer, if you look honestly, is not stillness. It is not clarity. It is not the kind of quiet self-possession that the Gnostic teachers were pointing toward. What the modern information environment is optimized for, what it is explicitly engineered to produce, is precisely the emotional states that the Gnostic texts describe as the food of the Archons. Outrage, anxiety, comparison, the desperate hunger for approval, the fear of being left behind, the shame of not being enough. Every platform that competes for your attention has been built by people who understand, with extraordinary precision, how to trigger the specific emotional states that keep you engaged. Not engaged in the sense of fulfilled or enriched, but engaged in the sense of unable to look away. The outrage cycle that moves through social media is not an accident, and it is not a side effect. It is the product. The anxiety produced by an endless feed of catastrophic headlines is not collateral damage. It is the mechanism. You are not the customer of these systems. You are the resource. And the resource being extracted is not your money or your time in the abstract. The resource being extracted is your emotional energy, your attention, the living current of your inner life. The ancient teachers who wrote the Nag Hammadi text did not have words for algorithms or engagement metrics or behavioral psychology. But if you place those texts alongside a detailed technical description of how a modern attention-based platform is designed, the structural parallel would be difficult to dismiss. The Archons, as described in those texts, do not punish. They do not chase. They do not need to. They simply construct an environment in which the specific emotional states they require are constantly being generated, and in which the human beings producing those states have been so thoroughly convinced that the emotions are their own that the question of their origin never even arises. This is the hidden language in its most refined form. Not a whisper in the dark, not a supernatural intrusion that you might notice if you were paying attention, but a total environment. A designed reality so seamlessly constructed around your emotional vulnerabilities that it does not feel like a cage at all. It feels like life. It feels like the world. It feels like the obvious and natural shape of things. And any attempt to question it, any moment of stepping back and asking why you feel what you feel and where that feeling actually came from, is immediately met with the response the system has prepared for exactly that moment. Mockery. The suggestion that you're being paranoid, the social pressure of consensus, the exhaustion of being the only one in the room who is not simply moving with the current. The Gnostic communities of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era understood that pressure intimately. They lived inside empires that had perfected the art of emotional management on a civilizational scale. The Roman Empire did not only control its population through military force. It controlled them through spectacle, through religious performance, through the careful management of fear and hope and collective identity. The Gnostics who gathered in small circles in Alexandria and Antioch and Carthage were doing something that their world considered dangerous, not because they were violent or revolutionary in any outward sense, but because they were attempting something far more threatening. They were attempting to become ungovernable on the inside, to develop an inner life that could not be reached by the mechanisms of emotional manipulation that surrounded them on every side. That is why their texts were destroyed, not because the theology was incorrect by some objective standard. Theology can be debated, refined, absorbed, and neutralized. What cannot be easily neutralized is a practice of inner discernment that trains a human being to notice when their emotions are being used as a channel of control. That kind of practice, if it spread, if it became common, if ordinary people began asking on a regular basis where their fear was actually coming from and who benefited from its presence, that would be genuinely destabilizing to any system that depended on emotional manipulation for its continuity. And so the practice was erased. The communities were scattered. The texts were buried. And the question that those texts were built around, is what I am feeling actually mine, became one of the most dangerous questions a person could carry. You are carrying it now. You have been carrying it probably for longer than you realize. That persistent sense that something about your inner weather does not quite belong to you. That occasional clarity, usually arriving in moments of stillness or exhaustion or deep grief, when the noise drops away and something underneath, it is briefly visible. Something that is not afraid, not ashamed, not longing, not rageful. Something that simply watches. Something that has never been touched by any of it. That is what the Gnostic teachers were pointing toward. Not a distant heaven, not an afterlife reward, not a doctrine to be believed or a community to belong to. A living recognition available right now, in this exact moment, beneath the surface of whatever emotional weather is currently moving through you. The hidden language of the Archons is spoken through feeling. And the answer to that language is not silence, not suppression, not the performance of spiritual calm. The answer is the thing the Gnostics called gnosis, the direct and immediate recognition that the part of you being spoken to is not the deepest part of you. That the fear is real, but the one who fears is not the whole of what you are. That the shame has weight, but the one who carries it has always been lighter than what it carries. This recognition does not arrive once and stay permanently. It comes and goes. It has to be practiced. It has to be returned to again and again, each time the language starts again, each time the transmission begins. But every time you return to it, every time you ask that question, even briefly, even imperfectly, something in the system loses a small portion of its grip. The language becomes slightly easier to recognize. The transmission becomes slightly less convincing. The emotions still arrive. Life still moves with all of its weight and beauty and difficulty. But the automatic identification, the reflexive collapse into the feeling as if it were the totality of what you are, that begins slowly and without drama to loosen. What the Gnostic teachers buried in the Egyptian desert was not a set of beliefs to replace the ones you already carry. It was a question. A single, quiet, endlessly renewable question that they considered so dangerous it had to be hidden from the world, is what I am feeling actually mine. 2,000 years later, in a world that has perfected the architecture of emotional manipulation to a degree those teachers could not have imagined, that question has not become less relevant. It has become the most urgent question available to any human being who wants to understand the nature of the life they are actually living. If something in what you just heard did not land as information, but as recognition, if some part of you already knew this without having the language for it, then you are exactly where this channel is meant for. Every week we go deeper into the hidden layers of what reality actually is and what the human being inside it actually carries. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next, because what comes next goes even further into the architecture of the system and how the spark inside you has always been beyond its reach.